Hello again, everyone. Today's Gospel reading is from Luke chapter 15, and it's a very familiar parable, the parable of the prodigal son. I'm sure you know this parable quite well, about the two brothers and the father and the younger brother going off, taking his share of the inheritance from his father and going off to have a wild time, and then running out of money and completely depleted of his resources. In fact, all he ends up doing in order to survive is to feed the pigs. And he comes to his senses and realizes that he's got to do something with his life. He cannot stay in that situation forever, and decides that he'll risk going back to his father and saying to his father, I have sinned against you and I'm not worthy to be called your son. But if you'll take me on as a hired servant, then I'll be happy with that. And then, of course, he does go home, and the father is waiting for him, and the father is so wonderfully excited and really throws a great party and celebration. And the younger son is overwhelmed by the father's love and acceptance and generosity, and I'm sure the whole feeling of how wonderful it is to be home and to be safe and to be secure and to be surrounded by people who are familiar and who really care about you. And the older brother, of course, is resentful. He's worked faithfully through the years, and there has been no kind of spirit of rebellion in him, and he resents the fact that his brother has gone off to live a wild life, and he resents the fact that when his brother has blown his inheritance, he comes home, and he resents the fact that their father makes such a fuss about the rebellious and the wayward younger brother. In the parable of the prodigal son, the older son then is good, and he is reliable, he is obedient, he is faithful, he takes his responsibility seriously, and he ensures that he fulfills his father's wishes in every detail. The younger son, by contrast, is greedy and reckless and irresponsible, and he squanders his share of the family's money. The father in the story is compassionate and forgiving. He is genuinely loving. All he wants is for his sons, both of them, to belong, to be secure, to know that they are loved, to make good choices for the right reasons, and to prosper. But if something should go wrong, and if they go off the track, then he wants them to know that they are welcome to return, and that he will love them as much as ever. When a son then makes a foolish choice and goes off the rails, the father is ready to accept his son back again with open arms. The younger son, at the end of the story of the parable, is in a better place spiritually and emotionally than the older son. The younger son has blown it big time. He knows what it is to be a failure. He has faced himself in the pig pit. And when he returns home, he is changed, and he is overwhelmed by his father's acceptance and love and undisguised delight to have him back again. The older son at the end of the story is angry and resentful and unable to share in the delight of his father, and unable to really welcome his brother back again and to share in his brother's joy as he experiences full restoration and the joy of being in an intimate relationship with his father in the family. Some have said that the parable of the prodigal son should be known as the parable of the prodigal father, because, of course, the word prodigal means to be recklessly extravagant. And, of course, the father is recklessly extravagant in his loving forgiveness. The younger son shows how it is necessary for us to experience some great personal crisis, very often, before we are able to understand the extent of God's love. The older son, one senses, is really unhappy in himself, and we only see a glimpse of what he's like on the outside. And of course his anger and his resentment reflects a lack of deep inner peace, and he's not happy in himself. He hasn't worked through any stuff. He resents his brother's waywardness, and he resents the fact that the brother has been welcomed. He feels inappropriately back into the home, not as a hired servant, but as a son. He probably resents the fact that the son, his brother, has returned at all, and would rather, I imagine, that his father would just kind of cut him off. And also, as the one sibling who is more responsible and more conscious of duty, the older brother believes that he is entitled to better treatment than his wayward brother. And clearly the older son is not liberated at all. Both sons have to discover the truth about their father's love, that the love of the father is unconditional and it is not dependent on their virtue or their good behavior or their deserving. And of course the younger son discovers that, but the older son is not able to discover that because he's not able to be honest. This prevents his experience of intimacy in the home of his father and with his family around him. The older brother is emotionally and spiritually immature, whereas the younger brother gains some degree of maturing. The younger son, after being welcomed home so exuberantly, of course, will have to get used to ordinary day-to-day life, the grind, and will have to get used to the fact that in this home, on a normal day, no one will really make a fuss about him. And so, although his homecoming is just this wonderful celebration, the homecoming is followed by days of ordinary living. And he will have to learn that, just like we all need to accept that most days are fairly ordinary. Sometimes perhaps we've been away for a long period of time and we've been missed by family and friends, and we return and there's great excitement initially and they make a bit of a fuss of us. But of course, after the initial encounter, after we've returned, things return to normal and it's a little bit dull. The parable of the prodigal son is first and foremost about God's radical forgiveness. The younger son hardly needs to confess his sin to his father, because from the moment that the father sees his son, he is beside himself with joy. It's almost as though the father doesn't give the son time to express his contrition. And I think that's true of repentance. By the time we come to God to say, I'm really sorry, I've blown it, God already sees the state of our heart and he knows our brokenness. And it's almost as though the words that we use are unnecessary. So the younger son has reached the depths of misery in the pig pit. He has seen himself as he really is, deep inside. He has seen the reality of his predicament. And when he's got to that lowest place in his life, the place of defeat and failure and misery and poverty and brokenness, at that moment he began to see a glimmer of light. I will trust in my Father's grace. Perhaps he'll be ready to forgive me. Perhaps he'll be ready to take me on as a hired servant. So he realizes that there is a possible way out. He's filled with godly sorrow, and in that moment of great personal poverty, he sees that he has one hope, one chance. The truth, of course, is that there always is a way out. That's not suggesting that it's easy and that we can escape the consequences of our decisions and our actions. And we might have to be involved in hard work to get back on track again. But there always is another option. And what matters is that we see that there is a possibility for something else. And of course, the great sadness of people who take their own lives is that they are unable to see the possibility of any sort of way out of their predicament. And I'm sure many of us have been in that kind of situation. We might have to live with the consequences of our choices or our actions, but all is not lost. Of course, I think of Judas and his decision to hang himself, and how he was in that situation of believing that there was no way out, there was no alternative, and so he should just end his life. If only we could see the possibilities of something else. Henri Nouwen says that we, at different stages of our lives, are each of these people. Sometimes we are the father, sometimes we are the prodigal son, and sometimes we are the older brother. And so we shouldn't try to decide which one of the three we are and expect that that will hold true for us permanently. Richard Rohr speaks of recognizing the imperfection that is in us and that is around us everywhere. Coming to terms with our own imperfection is critical for spiritual and emotional growth and health. Hypocrisy is pretending to be who we are not, refusing to see the inconsistencies and the contradictions in ourselves. And so if we continue as hypocrites, then we will tend to focus on other people's mistakes, and we will project our guilt onto other people rather than own our failure and our mistakes and our guilt. We'll even project some of our disappointment in ourselves onto other people. And we will try to focus on others who have blown it, maybe, in order to feel better about ourselves. And of course, all of this happens subconsciously. Brian McLaren says, we don't have to hide the real us, the sexual us, the insecure us, the doubtful us, the angry us, the complex us, the different, the tempted, the actual us. And of course, prayer is really about coming before God as we really are, with no pretense. The prodigal son initially was perhaps a bit full of himself. I deserve better than this. This is dull, just living here and with this daily grind, and it's so predictable and everything is so routine. The prodigal son was full of himself, overconfident, arrogant, and self-reliant. I can do this on my own. I can go and make something of my life. And whilst we're all encouraged to be independent and to some degree self-sufficient and to make it on our own and not be tied to our mother's apron strings, it is good for us to learn that we need each other. So the younger son is kind of impetuous and believes in himself a little bit too much. The older son sees himself as morally superior to his brother. He sees himself as more righteous, and of course seems to resemble the Pharisees in some ways, who were self-righteous and who believed in their own goodness and virtue and so on. Knowing who we really are, seeing behind what we pretend to be, acknowledging what lies beneath the surface, beneath the bravado, beneath the calm exterior, beneath the impression of having everything under control, of being perhaps smooth talking and so on. Acknowledging what lies beneath is essential for personal growth. The older son sees the world and his place in his father's home as being defined by scarcity, not abundance. The older son sees his place in his father's home as being defined by judgment and not forgiveness, by duty, and there is nothing to do with the desires of the heart, and defined by punishment, and nothing to do with restoration and forgiveness and so on. And the older son is concerned about outward show and doing things properly and being seen to do things properly, and is not really being authentic. He's not being himself, because it is fine to be good and upright and hardworking and faithful and conscious of one's duty, provided that one is at peace with oneself and is not harboring anger and resentment and so on. So he, the older son, remains trapped, mean, grudging, resentful, convinced that everything depends on proper performance. If only the older son could be liberated into fullness of life, where love, forgiveness, and acceptance abound. And unfortunately, that's where we leave the story, so we never get to find out what happens to the younger son and to the older son as the years go by. And of course, it is just a story. We needn't be afraid of doing it wrong, of going off the track, of blowing it. It is often the way to God. Pain, struggles, crises of one kind or another, mistakes, suffering, tragedy, experience of failure. These things can break open our hearts and lead ultimately to transformation and greater intimacy with God, and in fact greater intimacy with other people too. When we are in a situation which we can't fix or control or understand, that's where faith begins. Giving ourselves over into God's love and mercy in our poverty, our need, our unknowing, our struggles. This is what resurrection means. And so I close with another one of my prayers from the book that I produced some years ago, Casting Bread Upon the Waters. It's called You Love Me into Wholeness. You tell me I am wonderfully and fearfully made. Yet the mystery I encounter when I look at myself makes me a little afraid. I am troubled by the contradictions, inconsistencies, inconstancy, paradoxes, the strange, hidden, internal workings of mind and heart that produce such unpredictable responses. Sometimes, often, I am ashamed, seeing in myself what must appear to be ingratitude and insensitivity, blind to the sacred words lost on my deaf ears, beyond your reach and beyond the reach of anyone trying to connect. Beauty that should transport me, love that should warm me, truth that should inspire me, but I'm buried in some deep, selfish sadness. Detached. I am troubled by strange passions issuing from an unknown source, conflicting urges to approach, to hide, noble and ignoble dreams, the need to have, the desire to give, the hungry ego wanting greatness, the spirit prompting to renounce it all, frenzied rushing to accomplish, longing for stillness, silence, peace. I am so vulnerable. A complex machine with cogs, springs and wheels somehow working. A delicate concoction of confusing opposites precariously juxtaposed, somehow balancing, remaining more or less intact. A spindly plant trying to break through the foliage and raise its head to the sun. My one great solace in this bewildering existence, as I continue trying to be reconciled to this confused me, sometimes fearing what and who I am, all the while trying desperately to present a carefully groomed and pleasing mask of equanimity, my one great solace is that you know exactly who I am, who you are dealing with. You know the struggling human condition. You hold me together, gently sustaining the bits and pieces that constitute my being, creating a curious harmony with discordant notes. No one else has the same peculiar combination of this and that. You loved me into existence. You will love me into wholeness. You will help me through to heaven. Amen, and God bless.